I was dying in pieces, had been for 28 years, and I thought I'd made peace with it. But when my legs gave out during the most important presentation of my career, and hands that should have been ice-cold caught me with impossible warmth, I realized I hadn't made peace with anything. I'd just been waiting. Valerian Ashworth, the benefactor whose money built the lab I was bleeding in, held me like I was something worth saving. And when he looked at the vein pulsing in my throat, his ancient eyes didn't see weakness. They saw something that made a 600-year-old king forget how to breathe. What happened next didn't just change my life. It made me question whether the life I'd been fighting for was ever really mine to begin with. Before I tell you everything, I need you to know something. If you've ever felt like your own body was the enemy, like every morning was a negotiation with pain, this story sees you. And it doesn't look away. So, if that resonates, hit subscribe now. Because stories like this have a way of finding the people who need them most. Now let me tell you how I went from counting the days I had left to discovering that some forevers are worth the fall. I knew the crisis was coming 3 slides before it hit. The familiar ache had started that morning, a dull throb behind my ribs that I'd ignored because I'd been ignoring it for months. Because this presentation, this research, this moment was supposed to be the thing that made 28 years of broken blood cells mean something. The conference room at Cambridge's Cancer Research Institute gleamed with afternoon light. Polished surfaces, expensive equipment, faces of colleagues who had no idea that the woman explaining hemoglobin mutations was held together by stubbornness and prayer. As you can see from the cellular regeneration data, the words stuck. My vision blurred at the edges like watercolors bleeding together. I gripped the podium, knuckles whitening, and forced myself to continue. Not now. Please, not now. 3 months. That's how long I'd hidden the escalating crises from everyone. 3 months of slipping away to empty bathrooms, biting through the pain, refusing to let this body win again. I'd clawed my way out of foster homes, buried both parents before I turned 16, and put myself through MIT on scholarships and spite. I would not fall here. But my blood had never cared what I wanted. The room tilted. Someone was asking a question, Dr. O'Yelleran, I think, something about trial parameters, but the words came through water, distorted and far away. The faces around the table blurred into smears of color. Everyone was watching my presentation. But one person was watching me. Valerian Ashworth sat in the corner, where shadows gathered despite the afternoon sun. The Institute's mysterious benefactor. The man whose foundation had funded my research for 2 years, though I'd never spoken to him directly. He attended every major presentation, always silent, always observing from the periphery, like he was waiting for something. Today, his pale eyes hadn't left my face once. I felt his attention like a physical weight, not predatory exactly, but focused, patient, as if he'd been waiting through my entire presentation for this exact moment. My knees buckled. The floor rushed up, and I had one crystalline thought. After everything, this is how it ends. Collapsed on Italian marble, surrounded by people who will remember my research as that project the sick girl never finished. I didn't hit the ground. Arms wrapped around me, strong, impossibly warm against my clammy skin. I registered expensive fabric, the scent of something ancient and green, and then I was being lowered gently, so gently, to the floor. Everyone out. His voice was quiet, but it moved through the room like a commandment. Chairs scraped. Footsteps hurried. No one argued with that voice. When I opened my eyes, the conference room was empty. Just me, crumpled on the floor in my carefully pressed blouse, and Valerian Ashworth kneeling beside me, one hand still cradling my head like I was something precious and breakable. Your blood, he murmured, and his thumb traced the vein at my wrist with a reverence that made my breath catch. It sings differently than anything I've heard in 600 years. I should have been afraid. I should have pulled away, demanded explanations, reminded him that I was a scientist, and whatever he was implying was impossible. But I was so tired of being afraid of what my body might do to me. I'd never once considered what someone else might want to do with it. "You know what I am," I whispered. It wasn't a question. His eyes met mine, ancient, hungry, and unbearably tender. "I know what you're becoming." His warm hand pressed against my cheek, and for the first time in 28 years, the pain receded. "The question is whether you'll let me show you." I woke in the Institute's recovery suite to the sound of my own heartbeat on a monitor and the weight of someone watching me. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the Cambridge evening, but I knew he was there before I turned my head. Some presences don't need light to announce themselves. They just are, like gravity, like the pull of something ancient that your body recognizes before your mind catches up. Valerian Ashworth sat in the chair beside my bed, perfectly still in a way that living things aren't. His hands were folded in his lap, and his pale eyes tracked the rise and fall of my chest like he was counting breaths. Like each one mattered. "How long?" My voice came out scraped and hollow. 6 hours. He didn't move. "You've been stable for the last 4. Your colleague, Dr. O'Yelleran, wanted to call an ambulance. I convinced her that rest would be sufficient." I almost laughed. Rest. As if rest had ever been sufficient for what lived inside my blood. "You can't know that." I pushed myself up against the pillows, ignoring the familiar ache that bloomed behind my ribs. "You can't know that rest is enough. No one can. Not even my doctors." "I know," he said quietly, "because I've been reading your medical files for 7 months." The words landed like stones in still water. I stared at him, waiting for the anger to come, the violation of it, the fury at being watched and studied without my knowledge. But all I felt was tired. So unbearably tired. "Why?" He leaned forward, and in the dim light, I could see the way his jaw tightened. Like the answer cost him something. "Because your blood is doing something it shouldn't be able to do. Your sickle cells, the mutation you carry, it's not just destroying you. It's adapting. Evolving in ways that human hemoglobin hasn't evolved in 50,000 years. He paused. "And I needed to understand why before I approached you. I should have demanded explanations. Should have asked how he'd accessed records that were supposed to be protected, private, locked away in systems that required clearances I didn't even have. But the scientist in me, the part that had spent 6 years chasing impossible cures, that part was already leaning forward." "What do you mean, adapting?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite hope. Something older than hope and more dangerous. "My blood," he said carefully, "has properties. Old properties. Properties that haven't existed in any human medical database because humans don't survive long enough to study them." He met my eyes. "But your cells, they respond to those properties in ways I've never seen. When I caught you today, when my skin touched yours, your pain stopped. Didn't it?" I remembered. The sudden absence of agony, like someone had reached inside my veins and smoothed the broken edges. The warmth of his hands when everything about him should have been cold. "What are you offering?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Research access. My blood for your studies, as much as you need, whenever you need it. Full funding for your trials. A partnership that could change everything you think you know about cellular regeneration." He stood, moving to the window, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. "And transfusions. Regular ones. My blood to yours. It won't cure you. Nothing will cure you. Not yet, but it will buy you time." Time. The one thing I'd never had enough of. The one thing I'd stopped letting myself want because, wanting hurt worse than accepting. What do you get out of it? He turned, and for a moment, his composure cracked. Just a fracture. Just enough for me to see something underneath that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. I get to watch you work. I get to understand what your blood is doing and why. And he stopped. Started again. I get to see what happens when someone refuses to die the way they're supposed to. My chest tightened. Not from pain this time, but from something worse. Something that felt like recognition. 28 years. 28 years of being the girl who shouldn't have survived childhood. The teenager who shouldn't have graduated. The woman who shouldn't have made it to MIT, shouldn't have earned her doctorate, shouldn't be here at all according to every projection and probability and prognosis. And here was this creature, this impossible, ancient thing, looking at me like my refusal to disappear was the most fascinating data point he'd encountered in 600 years. I don't need saving, I said, and my voice didn't waver. Couldn't afford to waver. I've been saving myself since I was 12 years old, and I don't need a benefactor or a patron or whatever you think you're going to be. If we do this, it's research. It's data. It's two scientists studying an anomaly and nothing more. His mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Something sadder than that. You're not an anomaly, Alina. Then what am I? He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. The last light of evening caught his profile, all sharp edges and patient hunger. You're the first thing in 600 years that's made me wonder if eternity might be worth something after all. And then he was gone, and I was alone with my treasonous heart and the terrifying suspicion that I'd just agreed to something far more dangerous than a research partnership. But I'd spent my whole life being dangerous to myself. What was one more risk? The first transfusion happened 3 days after I left the recovery suite. Clinical. Controlled. His blood into mine through sterile tubes and careful measurements, because I refused to let this become something mystical when it could be something understood. But understanding didn't prepare me for how it felt. The warmth spread through my veins like sunrise after a lifetime of winter. The constant low-grade ache that had been my companion since childhood, the one I'd stopped noticing because noticing meant acknowledging, it didn't disappear. It quieted. Like a crying child finally being held. I wept in the lab that night after Valerian left. Not from pain. From its absence. From 28 years of not knowing what it felt like to exist inside a body that wasn't at war with itself. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Days belonged to the research, analyzing his blood samples, documenting the impossible ways his hemoglobin interacted with mine, writing papers I could never publish because the world wasn't ready for the truth hiding in my data. But the nights belonged to something else entirely. He came to the lab after midnight always. When the building was empty and the Cambridge streets had gone quiet and there was no one left to notice that the Institute's reclusive benefactor spent hours in a basement laboratory with a woman half the staff pitted and the other half had already written off. We worked in parallel, at first. Him reading my findings, me processing new samples, the silence between us comfortable in a way that unsettled me. I'd spent my whole life filling silence, with work, with plans, with the constant hum of what next that kept me from sitting too long with what is. Valerian didn't need filling. He existed in stillness like it was his native language, and somehow that stillness made space for things I'd never said aloud. It started small. A comment about a result that reminded me of a paper I'd read in graduate school. A question about my methodology that led to explaining how I developed it, which led to the professor who doubted me, which led to all the people who doubted me, which led somehow to a Tuesday night in November, when I told him about the foster homes. 12, I said, not looking up from my microscope. 12 homes in 6 years. Not because I was difficult, I wasn't. I was quiet and helpful, And I made myself small because small things don't get sent back. I adjusted the focus, watching his cells dance on the slide. But sick things do. Sick things are expensive. Sick things require accommodations that foster families aren't equipped to provide. So I learned to hide it. The crises, the hospital visits, the nights when I couldn't breathe without crying. I hid all of it, and they still sent me back. The silence stretched. When I finally looked up, Valerian was watching me with an expression I couldn't name. Something old and heavy and full of a grief that had nothing to do with me. I had a sister, he said quietly, in the life before. She was like you, fragile body, unbreakable will. She died in my arms during a winter I've spent 6 centuries trying to forget. His jaw tightened. I remember thinking that God was cruel to put such fire in vessels so easily broken. I set down my pen. You still believe in God? After everything you've seen? I believe in cruelty, he said, which requires something to be cruel. Whether that something has a name matters less than you'd think after the first 100 years. That was the night I stopped fearing him. Not because he'd shared something painful. Pain can be performed, weaponized, used to manufacture false intimacy. I'd learned that in foster home number 7, with a woman who cried about her own childhood while locking the refrigerator so I couldn't eat without permission. I stopped fearing Valerian because of what came after the confession. The way he turned back to his reading without demanding anything in return. No expectation of comfort. No need for me to fix or soothe or mother. Just 2 broken things existing in the same space, letting the silence hold what words couldn't. That was more dangerous than anything, because I knew what fear felt like. Fear was familiar. Fear kept me sharp, kept me guarded, kept all the soft parts of me protected behind walls I'd been building since the first family handed me back like a defective purchase. But this quiet comfort in his presence, this loosening in my chest when I heard his footsteps in the hallway, this wanting to tell him things I'd never told anyone, this was territory I'd sworn never to enter again. I'd loved before. Once. A man who said he could handle my illness until the 3rd hospitalization, when he sat on the edge of my bed and told me he couldn't watch me die in slow motion. That it wasn't fair to ask that of him. That he hoped I understood. I understood. I understood that love was just another word for temporary, and that needing someone was the fastest way to ensure they'd leave. But here I was, at 2 a.m, watching Valerian read my research notes with the focus of someone who genuinely cared about the answers, and I felt the walls trembling. You're staring, he said without looking up. I'm thinking. About how your presence has become the best part of my day. About how I've started hoping you'll stay late, and hating myself for hoping. About how I know exactly what this is and exactly how it ends, and I'm walking toward it anyway like a woman who's learned nothing from 30 years of loss. About cellular degradation patterns, I lied. His mouth curved, just slightly. Like he knew. Like he'd been waiting for me to catch up to what he'd already understood. And that terrified me most of all. The crisis came on a Thursday, 3 months into our arrangement, when I'd almost started believing my body had finally surrendered to something stronger than its own destruction. I was alone in the lab when it hit. Late afternoon, golden light streaming through the windows, Cambridge glowing amber and rose beneath a winter sunset, so beautiful it felt like mockery. One moment, I was reviewing data on cellular membrane integrity. The next, my blood remembered what it was. The pain started in my spine and radiated outward like cracks spreading through glass. I made it 2 steps toward the phone before my legs buckled, and then I was on the floor, curled around myself, trying to breathe through agony so complete it erased everything else. This was different. Worse. The crises I'd known my whole life were familiar enemies. I knew their rhythms, their peaks, their eventual retreat. This felt like my body rejecting itself at the molecular level. Like every cell that had accepted Valerian's blood was now screaming in revolt. I don't know how long I lay there. Time loses meaning when pain becomes your entire universe. But at some point, I became aware of hands on my face, cool and steady, and a voice cutting through the static. Alina! Alina! I'm here. I'm here. Valerian. On his knees beside me, his ancient composure shattered into something raw and desperate. He gathered me against his chest, and I felt him trembling. This creature who had lived through plagues and wars and centuries of loss, trembling because he couldn't stop what was happening inside my blood. It's not working, I gasped. Your blood. My body's rejecting it. I know. His voice broke on the words. I know.
I'm sorry.
I thought. I was so certain I could. He couldn't finish. Couldn't say fix you or save you or whatever promise he'd made to himself in the quiet hours when he thought I wasn't watching him watch me. And somehow, his helplessness hurt worse than the crisis itself. Because I understood helplessness. I'd lived inside it for 28 years, had learned to carry it like a second skeleton beneath my skin. But seeing it on his face, this man who had walked through 6 centuries with the certainty that time was always on his side, that broke something in me I didn't know was still intact. The crisis peaked and slowly, mercifully, began to ebb. My muscles unclenched by degrees. My breathing steadied. The world reformed itself around the edges, the lab coming back into focus, the sunset still painting everything in shades of gold and dying light. Valerian didn't let go. He sat on the cold floor with me cradled against him, one hand stroking my hair, the other pressed flat against my back like he was trying to hold me together through sheer force of will. I'm sorry, he said again, and his voice was hollow. I was arrogant. I thought my blood could do what medicine couldn't. I thought. You thought you could save me. Silence. Then, barely audible, yes. I pulled back just enough to see his face. In the golden light, he looked almost human, almost mortal, almost like someone who could understand what it meant to run out of time. No one saves me, I said quietly. I learned that a long time ago. People leave, or they die, or they decide the cost of staying is too high. And I survive anyway, not because I'm strong, but because surviving is the only thing I know how to do. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing the tear track I hadn't realized was there. That's not strength, he whispered. That's loneliness wearing armor. And something cracked open in my chest. Some wall I'd been building since foster home number 1. Since my mother's funeral, since every time I'd made myself small enough to need nothing from anyone because needing was just another word for losing. I kissed him. Not because I thought it would save me. Not because I'd forgotten who he was or what he was, or how many ways this could destroy me. I kissed him because I was so tired of waiting for permission from a body that had never given me anything but pain. Because if I was dying anyway, if my blood had already decided to unmake me despite everything, then I wanted one moment that was mine. One choice that wasn't about survival. His mouth was warmer than it should have been.
Softer.
He kissed me back for one endless, aching moment, and I felt 600 years of loneliness pressing against 28 years of mine, and it was almost enough. Then he pulled away. No. His voice was ragged, his forehead pressed against mine, his hands still cradling my face like I was something sacred and terrible. Not like this. Valerian, I will not take from you what your body is already stealing. His eyes met mine, and they were ancient and full of a hunger so controlled it looked like agony. I will not be another thing that happens to you, because you're running out of options. If I have you, he stopped, steadied himself. If I have you, It will be because you want me when you have 1,000 other choices. Not because you're falling and I'm the only thing close enough to catch. I understood then what he was offering, what he was refusing. He didn't want my desperation. He wanted my choice. And I hadn't made a real choice in so long that I'd forgotten what they felt like. Then give me choices, I whispered. Give me enough time to make them. His answer was to pull me closer, to hold me against his chest as the sun finished setting over Cambridge, to let the silence say what neither of us could. Outside, the city glowed like a promise neither of us believed in. And inside my blood, something was changing. They came for me on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the kiss that wasn't supposed to happen and the promise that still hung between us like smoke. I was walking back to my apartment from the lab, head full of data and heart full of things I refused to name, when I realized I wasn't alone. 2 figures flanked me on the empty Cambridge street, too still, too graceful, too wrong in ways my hindbrain recognized before my conscious mind caught up. The king's pet. The woman's voice dripped with amusement. She stepped into the lamplight, and I understood immediately why humans had spent centuries painting monsters as beautiful. Pale skin, dark hair, eyes like chips of obsidian. She smiled, and her teeth were very white and very sharp. I expected something more impressive. Lady Morvain. The name came out steady despite my racing heart. Valerian had mentioned her once, the head of a rival court, old as he was, twice as ruthless. I'm not his pet. No. She circled me slowly, the way a cat circles something it hasn't decided whether to kill or play with. Then what are you? His researcher? His project? His hope? She laughed, and it was not a kind sound. 600 years, and Valerian Ashworth finally finds something he's afraid to lose. Do you have any idea what that makes you worth to people like me? I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But I was also something else, something colder, harder, forged in 28 years of being underestimated by people who thought fragility meant weakness. I'm a scientist, I said evenly. Whatever value you think I have to Valerian, it's academic. Professional. You're making assumptions based on. I'm making assumptions based on the way his entire court has been whispering for months. Based on the way he's restructured his feeding schedule around your transfusions. Based on the way he looked at Lady Ashcroft when she suggested you might make a useful bargaining chip. Morvain's smile sharpened. I've known Valerian since before this country existed. I've never seen him look at anything the way he looked at her for threatening you. The words landed like blows. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Because I'd spent 3 months telling myself this was research, partnership, mutual scientific interest, and the whole time I'd been becoming something else entirely. A weakness. A liability. A chess piece in a game I didn't know I was playing. What do you want? I asked. Nothing tonight. Tonight, I just wanted to introduce myself. To let you know that the world you've wandered into has rules older than your entire genetic line, and you've been breaking them simply by existing. She leaned closer, and her breath was cold against my ear. Enjoy your borrowed time, little scientist. And remember, whatever Valerian has promised you, he's promised others before. They're all dust now. You'll be dust too, eventually. The only question is how much damage you cause on your way to the grave. Then she was gone, both of them, dissolved into shadows like they'd never existed at all. I stood on the empty street for a long time, shaking, trying to remember how to breathe. Valerian found me in the lab at midnight. I'd known he would. I'd left the door unlocked and the lights on, a summons he couldn't misread. Alina. Was any of it real? The words came out sharper than I intended. I didn't turn around, just kept staring at the data on my screen, data that suddenly seemed like the thinnest possible excuse for what had actually been happening between us. What did Morvain say to you? Answer the question. I spun to face him, and maybe he saw something in my expression, because he stopped in the doorway like he'd hit a wall. Was any of it real? The late nights, the conversations, the way you looked at me after the crisis. Was that you, or was I always just interesting blood? A scientific curiosity? A project that got out of hand? Silence stretched between us. In the harsh lab lighting, he looked less human than ever, pale, angular, ancient in ways that had nothing to do with appearance. You were never the blood, he said finally, and his voice was stripped bare, no composure left to hide behind. The blood was just how I found you. Something cracked in my chest. Some last wall I'd been holding up against exactly this moment. Then why didn't you tell me what I was becoming? What I was to you? What your court thinks I am? I laughed, and it scraped my throat raw. Lady Morvain knows more about your feelings than I do, Valerian. A woman who wants me dead has a clearer picture of this relationship than the woman actually in it. I was trying to protect you. From what? The truth? The fact that caring about me has made you vulnerable in ways your enemies can exploit. I shook my head. I've spent my whole life being someone's complication, someone's burden, someone's problem that needs to be managed or hidden or quietly removed. I will not be that for you too. That's not. I need you to leave. The words hung in the air like a blade. Valerian didn't move. Alina, please. I've spent 28 years fighting for a life that keeps trying to end itself. I have buried parents and outlasted foster homes and crawled through a disease that should have killed me a dozen times over. I know how to survive alone. My voice broke on the last word. But I cannot survive being someone's possession. Not even yours. Not even if you dress it up as protection or partnership or love. His face, God, his face. 600 years of loss, and I watched him experience a new one in real time. If you walk away, he said quietly, I won't follow.
I won't come to the lab.
I won't interfere with your research or your life. If that's what you need, I'll give it to you.
He paused.
But I need you to know that you were never a possession. Never a project. You were the first thing in 6 centuries that made me feel like time might mean something after all. I turned back to my screen because I couldn't look at him anymore. Because if I looked at him, I'd break, and breaking meant staying, and staying meant becoming something I'd sworn I'd never be again. Goodbye, Valerian. I heard him leave. The door closing softly. The silence that followed, heavier than any I'd ever known. And I sat alone in my lab, surrounded by data that suddenly meant nothing, and wondered if choosing loneliness was actually strength, or just the oldest lie I'd ever told myself. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after I sent Valerian away. Alone in the lab at 3 a.m, running the same analysis I'd run 1,000 times, I finally saw what I'd been missing. His blood didn't just interact with my sickle cells. It rewrote them. Given the right conditions, the right catalyst, the mutation that had been killing me for 28 years could be reversed entirely. Not managed. Not suppressed.
Cured.
I stared at the data until my vision blurred, and then I laughed, a broken, hollow sound that echoed off the sterile walls. The cure I'd spent my entire adult life chasing was right there on my screen, and I was too sick to use it. Because in those 6 weeks without his transfusions, my body had remembered how to die. The crises came daily now. Sometimes twice. My blood had grown dependent on his in ways I hadn't anticipated, and withdrawing it had accelerated everything. The doctors gave me weeks, maybe a month if I was lucky, if I rested, if I stopped working myself into the ground chasing a cure that would arrive just in time to save someone who wasn't me. I'd spent my whole life racing against this clock. And now, finally, I'd lost. He came to me on what I decided would be my last night in the lab. I was packing up my research, organizing files for whoever would continue the work, writing notes that read more like letters to a future I wouldn't see. I heard the door open and didn't turn around because I already knew. Some presences don't need announcing. They just are. You found it, Valerian said quietly. The cure. I found it.
My voice was steady.
I'd made peace with this, or something close enough to peace that it didn't matter. It'll work. Not for me, but for others. For every child born with this mutation who won't have to spend their life fighting their own blood. It's enough. It has to be enough. Silence. Then footsteps, and he was beside me, not touching, just there. Present in a way that made the air feel different. I didn't come to save you, he said. Good. Because I don't need. I came because I can't watch you disappear. I turned then, and what I saw on his face undid every wall I'd rebuilt in the past 6 weeks. No composure. No control. Just raw, ancient grief, wearing the mask of a man who'd finally found something worth losing eternity for. There's another way, he continued, and his voice shook. This king, this creature who had ruled courts and survived centuries, shaking. Not the transfusions. Something permanent. Something that would rewrite every cell in your body, including the broken ones. I knew what he was offering. Had known since that first night in the recovery suite, when he'd looked at my throat like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked in 600 years. Transformation. Yes. I would become like you. You would become more than you. He stepped closer, and his hand came up to cup my face. Gentle, so gentle, like I was already disappearing and he couldn't bear to grip too hard. I'm not asking you to become mine, Alina. I'm asking you to become more. More than this body that's betrayed you. More than the disease that's stolen your choices. More than the life that keeps ending before you're ready. Tears slipped down my cheeks. I hadn't cried in weeks. Had thought I'd run out. Used them all up on smaller griefs. But here they were, falling like they'd been waiting. You said you wouldn't follow me, I whispered. You said you'd let me go. I did let you go. I stayed away. I kept my word. His thumb traced my cheekbone, catching tears. But you're dying, and I cannot, his voice broke. Actually broke, this ancient creature, cracking apart in front of me. I have watched everyone I've ever loved die. I have held them as they faded and buried them in earth that forgot them within decades. I accepted that as the price of what I am. He leaned his forehead against mine. But I cannot accept it with you. Not when there's another way. Not when I can offer you centuries instead of weeks. Not when the only thing standing between you and forever is a choice I've been too afraid to ask you to make. And if I say no, then I stay until the end. I hold your hand while you go. And I spend the next 600 years learning how to exist in a world that doesn't have you in it. I closed my eyes, drew a breath that rattled in lungs that were already failing. 28 years of fighting to survive. 28 years of making myself small, needing nothing, expecting nothing, because expecting meant losing and losing meant drowning in grief I couldn't afford. I had built an entire life around not wanting things, because wanting was dangerous, because wanting hurt, because every time I let myself want something, it got taken away. But here was Valerian Ashworth, offering me centuries. Not as a possession, not as a prize, as a choice.
My choice.
The first real choice I'd made since I stopped believing choices were something people like me got to have. Not to save me, I said slowly. Not to save you. Not because I'm running out of options. Not because of that either. Then why? His answer was simple, and it shattered me completely. Because I love you. And I think you might love me too. And I would very much like the chance to find out what that looks like when we have time to do it properly. I kissed him then. Not desperate like before. not grasping or afraid.
Soft. Certain.
A choice made with eyes wide open and heart finally unguarded. Yes, I whispered against his mouth. On my terms. Always on your terms. The transformation happened in the lab, surrounded by the research that would save thousands of lives I wouldn't be there to see. He held me through it, the pain, the burning, the terrifying moment when my heart stopped and I hung suspended between what I was and what I was becoming. And then I opened my eyes. The world was different, sharper, more vivid than anything I'd ever experienced. I could hear the city breathing beyond the walls, could feel the pulse of life in everything around me, could sense Valerian beside me like a warmth I'd carry for centuries. How do you feel? He asked, and there was wonder in his voice.
Awe.
I stood, stretched, felt my new body respond, strong, whole, mine in a way it had never been before. I spent 28 years fighting to survive, I said, and my voice was steadier than it had ever been. Now I get to learn what it means to live. He took my hand. The city of Cambridge glowed beneath a winter sky, ancient and full of secrets, and I realized I had time now. Time to learn its stories. Time to continue my research. Time to love this impossible man and let him love me back. Time for everything. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it made you feel less alone in your own quiet war, there are others like us. Women who learned that surrender isn't weakness. Stories that don't flinch from the complicated wanting. They're easy to lose if you let them slip away. But they'll be here if you choose to stay. In this city, in this world, there are others. Women who chose impossible things, who let the night change them. We recognize each other now. And we are not alone.